Hello everyone and welcome to the Daily Signal's Top 10. And today we're counting down the top news stories of the week, many of which have gone either misreported or underreported in the mainstream media. I'm Jenny Maltabano, and here with me to break all of this down is my colleague at the Daily Signal, Jarrett Stepman. He's also co-host of the podcast Right Side of History. Jarrett, thanks for being with us.
Well, thank you so much for bringing me on.
A lot happened this week, but something funny that did take place a couple days ago, I don't know if you saw, President Trump was at a tax event in West Virginia, and he, I guess, was just done, and he threw his remarks, and it has sponsored a hilarious GIF we're going to show you. What did you make of that? I thought it was typical Trump, classic Trump.
It definitely was. It was definitely a funny incident that I'm sure years down the line we'll still see this GIF of Trump throwing these papers. I'm sure there'll be some creativity, people making different things out of him throwing different objects and things like that, but definitely, as you said, classic Trump.
Yeah, it was nice to have a lighthearted moment. Now on to the stories. Number 10, we're going to show you a clip about why the mainstream media will and has been ignoring the YouTube shooting already. Check this out.
Here's what comes out of this. First of all, the entire left, as soon as the shooting went down, said, okay, this obviously means we must have gun control. Because when you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Every single thing looks like a nail. And in this particular case, the hammer doesn't fit the nail because it's pretty obvious that this woman had serious problems. It's not clear where she got the gun yet. We don't know the answer. Depriving me of a gun would not have deprived this woman of a gun. At least we don't know that a blanket gun confiscation would have done that. This doesn't appear to have been an AR. And so this isn't going to be top-line news for the media for much longer than 24 hours. It would have been top-line news if this had been an NRA activist. It would have been top-line news if this had been a devotee of the Ben Shapiro show. But since this person is a weird person with mental illness and left-wing leanings and a Muslim background, that means that this is not going to be news beyond, the next 5 minutes. The media is going to bury this one. We'll get right back to Parkland, which has a nice narrative that the media can glom onto, ignoring, of course, all the facts about what happened in Parkland, where the FBI ignored warnings and the local police ignored warnings, and then the shooting happened anyway.
All right, so you just heard Ben Shapiro, editor-in-chief of the Daily Wire, breaking down why the mainstream media will and has been ignoring coverage of the YouTube shooting, even though it just happened Tuesday. I think he did a great job summarizing it. I thought an interesting point that he also makes, there are similarities to Parkland in that there were failures with the FBI, with authorities. The shooter's own father alerted authorities that same day they spoke to her. What did you think about this?
Yeah, and on top of that, a history of potentially mental illness. I mean, look, I think we saw some of the videos that she had produced, and some people use this to kind of laugh at this woman, but clearly she was having other mental problems, which we've seen with so many of these shooters. I mean, a lot of times people try to inject ideology into what they've done, or they've tried to inject some kind of views. But this person was essentially somebody who seemed to be a little bit unstable. They didn't really fit the kind of description that people wanted to drive a narrative in this case. And obviously, fortunately, she didn't kill anybody else. It was only herself. But here we have a very disturbed individual who basically took part in this crime. And, it really does say something about, the problem of mental health. I mean, so many of these shootings, not just now, but look through history. I mean, President McKinley was shot by a guy who was an anarchist, a little bit unstable. President James Garfield was shot by somebody who was mentally unhinged. So it's not as if this isn't something that's happened before, but, it's becoming a more serious problem now. And I think we've seen this with so many of these shooters is that a lot of them are unstable people.
Yeah, and you had a great piece in the Daily Signal this week, and one of the phrases you used was, it's another example of failing to connect the dots, and that is a huge problem.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, we saw this, there was another case in Kentucky recently where there was a student at the school who exhibited some very peculiar behaviors. People on campus started to notice that he was acting differently, that maybe he went out to purchase a gun. People notified the police. He took a bunch of pictures of himself with this gun, putting it in his mouth, things like this. People notified the police. The police actually took action and stopped this kid before he could do anything at his school. That's something we didn't see in Parkland. And there were so many things that led up to this horrible crime. And of course, everybody wants to blame the guns when there are all these other issues at stake here.
Jarrett does a great job breaking this down. Ben Shapiro also did an excellent job on his podcast. I would encourage you to check both of those out. Now on to number 9, Sean Hannity versus Jimmy Kimmel regarding First Lady Melania Trump. Watch this.
Be clever and curious, just like a cat. Ask lots of questions about this and that.
About this and that. Here, Kimmel, you realize what this means? You could be First Lady of the United States.
Ass clown Kimmel. Now, I got to tell you something. What a disgrace. Hey, Mr. Kimmel, that's her fifth language. How many do you speak?
This is the guy who defended the multiply alleged pedophile Roy Moore, and I'm a despicable disgrace. I'm the ass clown. Here's the thing. If I'm an ass clown, and I might very well be, you, Sean, are the whole ass circus.
As you can see, that was a very contentious debate between Hannity and Kimmel. It's interesting to watch, all about First Lady Melania Trump. Jarrett, what do you think?
I mean, it's interesting. I mean, of course, you know, Kimmel's background, you know, he had the Man Show and things like this, definitely did things that pushed the envelope. Now he's kind of like the voice of the left from these late night hosts. And, you know, as a very woke host, it's interesting to see him going after somebody who is, well, is an immigrant who speaks a little bit differently. And, you know, I think you actually wrote about a great piece about this, Jenny, that had a lot of controversy sparked on social media. Can you talk about that?
Hey, I really enjoyed writing this piece, and I've gotten a lot of support on it, but also some interesting pushback from the left. You know, I think it's appropriate to say that what Kimmel did was tasteless. If anything, just have respect for the office of the First Lady, right? At the same time, it's been funny on Twitter to see people saying, oh, you've been triggered, you're a snowflake. No, not quite. In fact, the way he edited it, sure, it was kind of funny, but I don't think that takes away from the fact that it was tasteless to do that to the First Lady. I mean, I think Rachel Campos-Duffy said it just so well on Fox News. When someone's put in the time and the work to learn the language, to assimilate, why make fun of them for something like their accent, which really is out of their control?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've always been careful about criticizing the First Lady. I mean, even, you know, Michelle Obama, many people on the right didn't like her, and, you know, she was sometimes attacked for things like her looks and stuff. And, you know, I was never one to kind of participate in those kind of attacks. The First Lady, sure, she's political, she has her own point of view. You know, sometimes it's good to lay off, especially in what is a kind of non-political environment like what she's doing, which is she's reading to kids and doing things like that. Look, I get the jokes and stuff like that, but, you know, there is a certain amount of tastefulness that I think that needs to go along with that, and certainly Jimmy Kimmel is willing to push the envelope on that for sure.
Yeah. And Melania faces a lot of criticism, but, you know, to her point, she does a great job of representing the country, so we'll definitely keep an eye on this. Now, on to number 8. We have a clip of someone very strongly defending the Second Amendment.
A whole lot of people in here talking tonight about this group and that group and domestic violence and blacks, these minorities and that minority. What I want to know is, when are you all going to start standing up for the majority? And here's who the majority is. I'm the majority. I'm a law-abiding citizen who's never shot anybody. It seems like every time we have one of these shootings, nobody wants to put the blame where it goes, which is at the shooter's feet. You want to put it at my feet. It does not make any sense. The law-abiding citizens of this community and many communities around this country, we're the first ones taxed and the last ones considered and the first ones punished when things like this happens.
So that's a very powerful clip. It's also one that Jarrett is very fired up about it, so I hope you appreciated it. Jarrett, what do you think is different about what he's saying? Why is it so important?
Yeah, I mean, I love this clip. I think this was great. I think this man cuts through a lot of the narratives that you're seeing on TV. He's just a concerned citizen saying, I'm tired of being trashed. I'm a law-abiding man who, you know, believes in my Second Amendment right to carry a gun, defend myself from the killers who have done these terrible things. I mean, I went to the march that happened a few weekends ago. This basically gun control march took place in D.C., the March for Our Lives, and there was so little debate and talk about the actual killers. It was all about the NRA, it was all about gun owners, it was all about taking away guns. Little was said about the actual monsters who committed these crimes. And what this guy is saying, essentially, I'm a good, decent, law-abiding citizen. I'm not going out to shoot anybody. I'm not out to commit crimes. I'm here to protect myself and my family. Why are there constant calls for the government to take away my rights and my freedom to do so?
And you see now people who feel very strongly about the Second Amendment. They're supportive. They are coming out more. In fact, there were a couple of school walkouts this week with students in favor of the Second Amendment. So we're starting to see people become a little bit more confident and say, hold on a second, this perhaps isn't as skewed as the mainstream media would have you believe. So I think it's important to follow. There's a lot.
That's absolutely right, Jenny. And I think what's important to note in this, I mean, this is kind of the common narrative from the left, is that it's the National Rifle Association is the reason why we have this pushback against gun control. It's not because of the NRA. It's because there are millions of Americans who believe in their Second Amendment rights. And they're here all the time about people who want to restrict that. And even some calls for just outright removal of their God-given rights. And so I think when they hear this, I think there are a lot of regular people out there who hopefully now will show up at town hall meetings and make their kind of voices heard in this matter to say, look, we're a majority in this country of law-abiding people who have guns, who don't break the laws, who don't go on mass shootings, who want to defend ourselves. You know, we have a very strong voice. It's not one that the media or entertainment industry would like to put out there, but it's a very, very powerful grassroots kind of surge in opinion out there that this man, I think, perfectly demonstrates.
He did, and I think you did a great job saying it is a surge. We should keep an eye on it because the great thing about our country is we can't express our beliefs. Number 7, there's a double standard because President Trump is now sending the National Guard to the border. Check this out.
A nation that cannot, or worse not, chooses not to defend its borders will soon cease, in fact, to be a sovereign nation. The threat is real. We've talked about it over the last 18 months. The Department of Homeland Security, since its creation in 2003, has watched for current and emerging threats. Despite a number of steps that this administration has taken, which I'll talk about shortly, we continue to see unacceptable levels of illegal drugs, dangerous gang activity, transnational criminal organizations, and illegal immigration flow across our border. This threatens not only the safety of our communities and children, but also our very rule of law, on which, as you know, our country was founded. It's time to act. So let's talk a little bit about that today. In an effort to prevent such a consequence, the President has directed that the Department of Defense and the Department of Homeland Security work together with our governors to deploy the National Guard to our southwest border to assist the Border Patrol.
So that was Homeland Security Secretary Kirstjen Nielsen giving that announcement at the White House earlier this week. You know, I think she's a great spokeswoman, and what kind of makes me chuckle about this is it seems like with the census and with a lot of arguments, the left, their go-to is, oh, this is unprecedented, it's not constitutional. Well, just like with the census, there is presidential precedent on this move. I mean, both Bushes, President Obama, and then going further back, Woodrow Wilson, Taft. What do you make of this?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we have called out troops to go to the border. I mean, early in the 20th century, there was a revolution that took place in Mexico. Things got very dangerous there. There were cross-border raids, and we basically put troops on the border. I mean, this is, to a certain extent, you know, what our military can be used for. I mean, it's not necessarily always the best solution for the problems at the border. I do think that there are other long-term solutions that do need to be made in this matter beyond just placing soldiers at the border. Honestly, our military should not be just permanently marching back and forth on the border. There are other solutions, of course, like things like the wall that Trump has talked about on his campaign, something that has been in the we've talked about for a long time in this country, is finally enforcing our border laws.
Yes.
So I think there are definitely other ways to do this, but look, we've called the military to the border before. This is not something that's unprecedented. It's happened many times in our history. But I really thought Nielsen's response to this whole thing was actually excellent, the way she responded to the media. What did you think of that,
I
Jenny?
thought she did a great job. I think in her, he's found an excellent spokeswoman who can really handle the press well, get the message out there, use numbers and facts. I was very, very impressed. And I think it's fair to say, even if you don't agree on this from a policy standpoint, it's not fair to say that this is unprecedented.
Yeah, absolutely not. Again, going back throughout our history, we've called out the troops to do this before. And look, let's hope this gets solved in other ways. I mean, it's something that I think we've let fester for far too long, and I think there are a lot of frustrated people in this country that say, well, at least the president's doing something about this problem.
Mm-hmm. I agree with you completely. On to number 6. This might shock you. 1 million illegals have driver licenses in California. 1 million. Can you break this down? Because there were laws on the books that restricted access. And actually, California, I think it was in 1993, was one of the first states to restrict access. And then something like 45 more states followed up on this. But then a couple years ago, California changed their tune.
Yes, it was actually in 2013 that California changed their tune. Throughout the 90s, California didn't give access to driver's license to illegal immigrants. And look, I mean, there's, to a large part, I see this as, I mean, people always talk about, well, threats to democracy, things like that. I mean, what could be a bigger threat to democracy? We have people who are not citizens of the United States being issued essentially government licenses and things like that. I do find it funny that, California, is so eager to issue licenses to illegal immigrants, yet of course, there are many in California who get very upset the idea that you may have to use a license as a legal citizen to vote in California or other parts of this country. I do find that to be, kind of a funny thing and kind of a double standard there. But look, I mean, we have, this huge issue of illegal immigration in California. We have the state itself telling DMVs that they have to issue these licenses, there are a lot of people in California who are just not happy with this system. There seems to be an unfairness there, as if the state is going out of its way to curtail the people who are not citizens of this country. Don't you think that's a little ridiculous, Jenny?
I do. I just think it's extremely hypocritical, as you said, and I know we'd love to hear from our viewers. What do you think about this? Jared's made some great points on this, so we'll continue to keep an eye on those numbers. Now on to number 5, Trey Gowdy and Tim Scott have been going on a big promotional tour about their new book, Hope for a Unified Nation. Watch this.
In retrospect, one of the reasons why Unified is so powerful for me is because the book talks about the paradigm shift that occurred in my own heart. I was called the N-word in high school. I had some real challenges. And Trey, on that Wednesday evening at about 10 o'clock, I called the white guy. I didn't even know before I came to Congress.
Why'd you call him?
Because he had become the most trusted confidant that I had in a town where you don't make friends. If you want a friend in D.C., buy a dog.
Yeah.
You don't look to another person. And Trey was just, he was there. He walked that road Wednesday evening with me. He attended the funeral and some of the wakes. He was a powerful force anchoring me during a time where I just thought, the tragedies are back again.
So you just saw them discussing their new book. I think they're such a great duo. I find them so funny. They're obviously good friends. We were just talking, Jared and I. Trey Gowdy is leaving Congress. A lot of people see that as a huge loss. But what a way to go out on this promotional book tour.
Yeah, it is great. I've kind of followed the careers of both these men. They've been definitely, their popularity goes outside even their districts. I mean, around the country. Of course, Scott is now a senator. But I think their popularity goes around the country because they're kind of unusual, unique characters. I mean, Tim Scott, here's a guy, honestly, he's a black man from Charleston, South Carolina, came as part of the Tea Party wave, talking about, some of the problems, the racial strife that happened in his state, and what an incredible thing it is that now, he's been elected to Senate there in South Carolina. He has this good friend, conservative Trey Gowdy, who's been a very, potent voice in Congress and has been, of course, the kind of attack dog that we've seen on so many of these committees. So this has kind of been a great relationship, showing that, look, we can have a little bit of civility in our politics, and these guys have been great. What do you think about that?
Well, I think it's wonderful. They've both proven they can really break through the noise. And like you just said, their popularity does span outside of their districts and who they represent. And I think that nowadays that's especially rare as politics becomes more and more divisive and full of kind of this anger and hate. It's nice to see them to keep up this friendship, keep breaking through, and come up with something like the book to leave a legacy on.
Absolutely. Do you think the left is going to embrace these two individuals, or do you think that there's going to be some pushback? I mean, what do you think, Jimmy?
Absolutely not. I don't think they'll embrace it whatsoever, but I do think it could bring conservatives together. So I think it's a unique opportunity, and I can't wait to read it. All right, on to number 4, Saudi Arabia in the news again. They've actually opened an AMC theater in their country. Now, this might not seem like a big deal to us, but it actually is, and their crown prince was actually just in New York and DC a couple weeks ago. He has said, how he wants to modernize things. He met with the Jewish and Christian leaders. So while this might seem minor, it's actually not, right, Jared?
Yeah, this is actually a very big deal because what the crown prince is doing, and he's basically taking over leadership there in Saudi Arabia. He's trying to show that Saudi Arabia is changing for the better, and frankly, he's trying to build his alliance with the United States. Over the years, we've given a lot of aid to Saudi Arabia. We've kind of been behind them. There's been a lot of criticism of the United States being in close relationship with the country. That, look, there have been terrorists who've come from Saudi Arabia specifically. I think that's always been a huge concern. But it's an important step, especially in the 21st century, for Saudi Arabia. That's not always going to have these massive oil reserves behind them. Not always going to have these advantages that they've had on the foreign stage. Are they going to make some changes there that are going to make them better allies for the U.S. and for the West? And I think this is a good first step, big step, especially, even though it seems like something small, it is pretty big if you look at the last 30, 40 years in Saudi Arabian history.
Diplomatically, this is a huge step. There's a lot of opportunity here, but I think we also forget how big of an opportunity this is for the people there, especially the women. Can you touch on that?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, this is a country that didn't even allow women to drive at one point. Access to movie theaters, and they're finally going to have their first, I guess they're going to be showing Black Panther in their theaters, and they're going to hopefully have some more. Not that the influence of Hollywood's always a good thing, but it does show that they have a little more cultural contact with the rest of the world, and there's clearly demand within the country for this to happen. It is a little hard to believe, as somebody, a woman in Saudi Arabia who wouldn't even be allowed to drive. I mean, that's a fairly repressive environment.
Absolutely. I mean, this will be interesting to watch, to continue to see how they're going to keep modernizing. Now, on to number 3. This was an interesting story. So a white privilege handout was given to a second grader. Now, I was thinking about this before, about how I would react, if I were a mother and my child, who was a second grader, came home with a pamphlet about white privilege. And while there certainly is a degree of racism that exists, and it's important to talk about, does that responsibility, should a teacher be forced to do that? What did you make about this?
Yeah, it's interesting. We were just talking about Scott and Gowdy just earlier, trying to build, better relationships. There's obviously been racial tension in this country. Honestly, this kind of stuff just opens that up. It makes young people think, well, gee, I've been treated badly, or, oh, I've been privileged. The only reason why I've done anything right in my second grader's life is because I'm privileged. I have to say, from my own perspective, look, everybody who's born in America is a privileged person. Thank God, I was born here in the United States. And we should all be thankful that we are here in this great country. To try to create kind of racial tension between classmates to say, well, this one group is privileged, this one group is oppressed, leads to a lot of division, especially for second graders who don't understand the politics behind this. And, could you imagine your own second grade classroom having this stuff handed to you? What would you think of that?
No, I mean, when I was a second grader, my biggest concern was, what grade I got on my math test, or who I was sitting next to at lunch, and which book I was going to read next. So I definitely don't think that teachers should take it upon themselves. I think it's an important discussion about racism more broadly, but that not for the second grade level.
What do you think this is going to bring more calls of things like school choice and some changes to our education system in the near-term future?
Absolutely. I think that this definitely helps people who do want school choice, because people want their kids to have the best experience for them.
Absolutely.
All right, number 2, there's been giant controversy over Sinclair. Jarrett's done a lot on this week. Watch this clip and then we'll unpack it.
Hi, I'm Fox San Antonio's Jessica Headley.
And I'm Ryan Wolf.
Our greatest responsibility
is to serve our
Treasure Valley communities,
the El Paso, Las Cruces communities,
Eastern Iowa communities,
Mid-Michigan communities.
We are extremely proud of the quality, balanced journalism that CBS 4 News produces.
But we are concerned about the trouble and trend of irresponsible, one-sided news stories
plaguing our country.
The sharing of biased and false news has become all too common on social media. More alarming, some media outlets publish these same fake stories without checking facts first.
The sharing of biased and false
news has become all too common on social media.
More alarming, some media outlets publish these same fake stories without checking facts first.
Unfortunately, some members of the media use their platforms to push their own personal bias and agenda to control exactly what people think. And this is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
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 All right, so Jarrett had a great piece out this week on this controversy. He and our editor-in-chief, Rob Bluey, did a fantastic interview with the president of Sinclair. So Jarrett, first, can you break down what the controversy is and also why you say this isn't relatively new?
Right, I mean, the controversy is essentially that Sinclair has used the same promo and most of its local news broadcasts. It's a giant media company that's now gone into the local media market. So, of course, Deadspin had this clip of all these different hosts saying the same exact lines, which, if you clip them all together, it sounds kind of creepy. It sounds like, oh, this is something really ominous. But when you actually break it down to the individual clip, frankly, the wording of it's fairly innocuous. In fact, I mean, something I noted in my own article is that this could have been said by Washington Post, could have been said on CNN, things like that. People wouldn't have batted an eyelash. Because the ownership group at Sinclair leans to the right, I think that's why you're seeing the sudden freak out. Because, look, I think a large part, legacy media is afraid it's losing control of the media narrative. The media has been decentralized in this era of new media and the internet, and they're worried that the narratives are going to change, that at the local level there are going to be networks that don't always just cover exactly what liberals want to see covered. And I think there's definitely a lot of panicking here, and I think there are a lot of other companies that frankly are also upset because Sinclair's been very successful as well, and they've entered the marketplace. And look, there's going to be some forces against that. So I do think there's just been a little bit of much ado about nothing. I don't think it looks great to have all these clips done exactly the same, but we've seen this for years. I mean, Conan O'Brien on his shows has pointed out these same puff pieces being shown on the same networks over and over and over again. You know, this isn't a threat to democracy. I mean, as people are saying. I mean, trying to go in and use the government to say that you have to stop, that is a threat to democracy.
So what you're saying is when people first kind of see this mashup, their instinct might be to say, oh goodness, what's going on? But you're saying don't overreact.
Absolutely. I think there have been calls that, oh, this is looming authoritarianism. You had a video by Dan Rather, of all people, who actually got fired for running a fake news clip about George W. Bush before an election. Very dramatic says, well, you have to worry about this. This is coming authoritarianism, this fake news, people reading off a script. I find that awfully rich coming from him. And we've had some really extreme measures taken by, for instance, Senator Dick Durbin saying that, well, you know, this kind of bias, it needs to be looked into and investigated. I mean, this is a government official saying that we need to investigate the private practices of an editorial board. Again, if there's a threat to our democracy, a threat of authoritarianism, isn't it for people in the government saying that we need to go to private companies and tell them how they're going to report, how they're going to have the news, how they're going to do their editorials? That's scarier than anything else.
Yeah, I think you've hit the nail on the head. And on to Dan Rather. He clearly can say whatever he wants, but I don't know if he really should be commenting on fake news.
No.
All right, our last story. The left is going after EPA Chief Scott Pruitt. Here's our colleague at the Daily Signal, Genevieve Wood, breaking down why this is happening.
You know why they are going after EPA Secretary Scott Pruitt? I can give you at least 3 reasons. Number 1, he has led the Trump administration's efforts to dismantle President Barack Obama's expensive and ineffective climate legacy piece by piece. From the Clean Power Plan, which was all about Obama's climate agenda and which had nothing to do with creating clean air, we already have laws about that, to the Waters of the United States regulation, which could turn a puddle in your front yard into environmentally protected swampland. Pruitt has been rolling back many of the regulations put in place by Obama's overzealous, power-grabbing, and arguably unconstitutional EPA. Number 2, they also don't like the fact that just this week, Pruitt's team at the EPA revised a mandate on fuel standards that will make new cars significantly cheaper, maybe as much as $7,000 cheaper. Number 3, under Secretary Pruitt, the EPA has announced it will no longer develop regulation based on secret science, meaning studies only the so-called experts at the EPA, but not the public, can see. It's called transparency, and believe me, the deep state in Washington hates that. So no, Secretary Pruitt doesn't believe the EPA is an all-powerful agency with no accountability except to itself. And no, he doesn't believe we should be creating useless regulations that eliminate jobs and make families pay more for energy just so Al Gore and most of Hollywood can feel good about themselves. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is why they are going after Scott Pruitt.
So that was our colleague at the Daily Signal, Genevieve Wood, breaking down some of the top reasons why Scott Pruitt is being attacked. And I have to give Molly Hemingway a great shout out. She had an excellent piece in the Federalist that we can discuss, explaining basically that Scott Pruitt is one of the, if not the most effective cabinet members that President Trump has, and it would be a real loss to see him go. Now, Jarrett, let's tackle what he's been doing. Why is this such a coordinated kind of hit job?
Well, yeah, I mean, you said it right there, and that's another thing Molly Hemingway spoke about or wrote about. She said that it seems awfully coincidental that suddenly all these hit jobs have come out all at the same time. They're going after Scott Pruitt, and I think the answer is he's been marvelously effective at his job recently. I mean, he's gone back and looked at some of the regulations that are coming down from the EPA. Nick Loris, who is at the Heritage Foundation, has written some great pieces in Daily Signal talking about how they've changed some of their standards, which are going to lower the price on a lot of the cars that are coming out, so that you're going to see this when you buy a new car, its price will go down because they're not going to force car makers to essentially adhere to these standards that were definitely over the top. And he's added transparency to the department as well. I mean, he's added essentially these kind of science numbers that were hidden from the public. He's demanding the EPA release these numbers and release these studies. You know, these should be good things. Now, obviously, people on the left don't like these ideas. They don't like these changes. It goes against the kind of agenda when it comes to climate change and things like this. And it does look like, Ginny, like there's a coordinated effort from the left to try to stop what he's doing.
Yeah, and this is not the first time that something like this has happened. And what's great about Scott Pruitt is he's gone into an agency as notorious as the EPA. He's followed President Trump's instructions. He's deregulated. Like you mentioned, he's pulled the curtain back on secret science. Heritage expert Darren Bax has some great pieces on this. He's making a lot of changes, and naturally, I'm sure the left, as we can see, they're freaking out.
Absolutely. I mean, we've seen. I mean, they talk about the deep state kind of issue in Washington, D.C. It's very hard as a secretary. This, very large department. There are a lot of interests within the EPA that kind of embrace that left-wing agenda. And, Scott Pruitt's come in, as kind of a long-term critic of the EPA, saying that its role should be much more narrowly focused on, simple things like clean air. And because he's changed that environmental agenda, because he's actually been effective at his job, he's certainly, I would say, been one of Trump's most effective secretaries. Because he's had success, we have a lot of people that want to see him gone, want to ensnare him in whatever they can, no matter what it is, no matter what the scandal is.
He's clearly been very effective, and the Daily Signal has actually gotten several exclusives with him. So we would encourage you to go check out those interviews to find out more specifically what Scott Pruitt has done. Now, that's been a busy week. We've had a lot to unpack here. Jarrett, what has been one of your favorite stories of the week?
Well, actually, this is something that's coming up. This weekend is the new movie, Chappaquiddick, is coming out about Ted Kennedy and his role in, unfortunately killing a woman who was working with his campaign in a car crash. And I think this is a big story that, frankly, over the last 30 years hasn't been talked about enough. How a sitting senator, a man who was considered a lion of the Senate, actually committed this horrible thing and yet had a career at the end of it. I think it's a big story, and I'm looking forward to the movie. Hopefully it's good.
Yeah, I actually got to see an advanced screening of it. It was excellent. It was so well done. I would encourage everybody to go see it. They did a really good job of not trying to pull it one way or the other. They just presented the facts like we have them, and they gave Mary Jo a face, which hasn't really been done in the past 30 years.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's good to see that, the kind of real story. Obviously, there's some people that aren't going to be too happy about this coming out, but this is about getting to the truth, and hopefully Hollywood does a good job with this one.
Yeah. All right, thank you all for joining us this week. We'll see you back here next week, same time, same place. Have a great weekend.